Polls show that most Australian voters feel that the 2014 federal budget is unfair. The budget has been criticised for unfairly burdening young Australians, future pensioners and retirees, and for drastically cutting foreign aid. Anglican Media Melbourne asked several not-for-profit organisations their thoughts on the budget. Anglican Overseas Aid CEO, the Reverend Bob Mitchell, said that he is worried that the collapse of AusAid into the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the new focus on regional assistance might mean that vital maternity services in East Africa will be cut.
Just under half of our income comes from federal sources, and the remainder from private donations, particularly churches and parishioners within churches. The department that we formerly had most to do with was AusAid, which was an independent executive agency. That was collapsed last November, and its functions were subsumed within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So clearly, of course, the current government is interested in poverty alleviation, but perhaps where that's coincidental with other interests that are perceived to be in our national interest. So the consequence of that for us is that a large part of our programming is in Africa. It's no secret that the government intends to reduce the amount of funding that's made available for programs in Africa to the tune, I think, of about 100 million. The detail of how that will play out is still unfolding. The largest one is a program that's funded through a window called ACES, the Australian African Community Engagement Scheme, and it's a child and maternal health project based in Kenya and in Ethiopia. And it is really looking at improving maternal health amongst nomadic pastoralist communities where access to clinical care is very limited. And so we're doing things like training up traditional birth attendants to help in delivery of a safe delivery of children in very remote locations and that kind of thing. So it's a broad-based child and maternal health program, and it is funded under a window which has the potential to be impacted by these budget cuts. We're working with nomadic tribal pastoral communities, Samburu people in Kenya and different groups in the Afar region of Ethiopia, so there's very remote areas. And these are mobile communities as cattle is moved around in search of fodder. And obviously, if you're a woman in a mobile nomadic community, access to more traditional or Western forms of clinical care is limited. The removal of funding from that program, I think, would be a very retrograde step, because these are communities where there is significant need. And I think the interim results from the program have been very, very positive. Well, I do think that Australians are very generous people, and they are interested and motivated to contribute to the issue of global poverty, and that is demonstrated by the fact that over the last 10 years, private donations, private giving to organisations like this one has steadily increased. So you can see the emergence of a bit of a dissonance between the preferences expressed by the Australian public in terms of their growing financial commitment to foreign aid and the deployment of a significant proportion of that aid in the continent of Africa. So I do think that Australians care about foreign aid, and I do think actually in times of austerity and economic difficulty it's more important than ever, and I think the Australian public knows that. We are willing to do our absolute best to try and do more with less. But when your financial resources in a global sense are at risk, it makes life very hard. It's also very demoralising for staff who come and work out of a sense of idealism about making a positive difference in the world when those efforts are not supported as well as they could be by our federal government. One of the concerns that we have as an organisation about the federal government is the loss of the commitment to grow Australia's aid budget to 0.5% of gross national income. That target had been deferred by previous governments. It had been maintained by the coalition government as an aspirational goal, and now it's evaporated altogether.
Aged care providers Benetas CEO Sandra Hills said that the elderly were losers in the budget arithmetic, with pilot programs under threat.
Well, Mr Hockey, he talks about every Australian doing the heavy lifting, but I think in the budget it's really the families, unemployed people and young people are the ones that are most hard hit. Benetas is responsible for providing services to older people, so our main area of focus is going to be there. The 14-15 budget has been preceded by preparation of an extensive reform process. Now, many of you would know about this. It's a reform process in aged care that was commenced by the previous Labor government, and it was known as Living Longer, Living Better. And the current federal government haven't stepped down on those recommendations. They are, in fact, following them through. So when we talk about the budget that was announced the other night, we also need to keep in mind what some of those reforms are, and some of them, many of them actually come into effect from the 1st of July. The pillar underpinning the reforms is there is also a gradual shift to user pays. And when you think about some of the budget changes that were announced on Tuesday night, we need to consider this. So what that means is that people who can afford to pay more in the area of accommodation and care will. Vulnerable and at-risk older people, we believe, are the most affected in this budget, and they are the losers. As a provider of community and residential services in Victoria, we see firsthand the impact of poorly managed health issues in older people. So the first area of concern for us is the cost of access to primary health care services, which is already a major issue for older people. Increasing the cost of a GP consultation and pharmaceuticals, especially for older people with chronic illnesses, might deter them from getting the care they need where and when they need it. If older people experiencing poor health, especially people on low income, are deterred from seeking necessary health care because of rising costs, we have some serious problems. The reduction of the annual growth rate in the Commonwealth Home Support Program. This is an area that's undergoing reform, and people might know it as HAC, Home and Community Care. It's a service that many local governments provide, so it's normally lower level care in the home. This program, by reducing the growth in this program, it just doesn't seem consistent with the government's commitment to support older people to stay at home longer. It also doesn't reflect the need to grow home care services, as initially outlined in the government reform, which they refer to as Healthy Life, Better Ageing reforms. So it leaves us with wondering whether ageing still does remain a policy priority for the current government if funds are being redirected from this area. That's the reversal of the Housing Help for Seniors pilot. Now, this was just a pilot, but what the budget has done is they've cancelled this program, which was a recommendation from the National Commission of Audit, and it was that allocated $1.73.1 million over 5 years. But the program was to provide an income and assets test exemption for pensioners who downsize their home. Now, we would all know people who, one or two people who, once a family have gone, they rattle around in this big home. So this was really an incentive for them to be able to downsize their home, buy a smaller home, thereby selling that home to or renting that home for a larger family, but importantly not ensuring that they weren't going to receive their part pension or their pension that they were receiving. So this has been completely got rid of.
Brotherhood of St Laurence Executive Director Tony Nicholson said the budget was an unfair burden on Australian youth that could trap young people in a poverty cycle.
At the Brotherhood of St Laurence, we have a particular concern around how young people are going to fare under the provisions made in the budget for assisting young people into work. We know that in Australia we've got an incredibly high rate of youth unemployment at about 12.5%. So that's double the overall rate of youth unemployment. And in some parts and in some communities around Australia, it's as high as 20%. So it's good that the government has decided to give it policy attention, and we certainly agree with the Prime Minister about the objective of learn or earn. That's what young people need, that's what they want. What we're concerned about is how you actually implement strategies that will achieve that objective. And at first glance, and the budget papers are quite scant in detail, but at first glance, they appear to be quite harsh policies and potentially have very serious unintended consequences. This idea that young people will have to go without any income support for 6 months is a really potentially severe situation for young people. So I think, and I'm hoping that it's a policy where its saving grace may be in the detail of how it's implemented. I'm hoping so, and I'm certainly keen for the Brotherhood to engage and work with the government to ensure its implementation will not only ensure that we don't have serious unintended consequences for young people, but equally importantly, that it will help young people make the transition from school to work a much more smoother one. Now, the government says that there will be a lot of exemptions. That's good to hear. However, we know that so much will depend upon how the circumstances of young people are assessed and addressed. And we know that these are carried out within Centrelink, and we know that the Centrelink's assessments of the circumstances of young people has been notoriously inaccurate. So, for example, it's been not uncommon for homeless young people to be assessed and categorised by Centrelink as requiring a minimum amount of assistance, and they wouldn't be exempted. In fact, there was some research done by the government that was unpublished 2 years ago that showed that Centrelink only picked up the homelessness of people on about half of the time. There is no doubt that, in my mind, that this budget doesn't really pass the equity test, and particularly as it applies to young people. They are carrying a pretty big burden here under these policies announced in the budget. It is critically important that we don't withdraw a safety net from young people, and I'm particularly concerned about young people who don't have the support of family and can't go back to live at home. So we know that in Australia there are about 40,000 young people who are in receipt of Centrelink support who can't live at home. What we know from our daily experience of the Brotherhood of St Laurence is that young people, perhaps more than anyone else, understand that if they're going to build a good life for themselves, they've got to be able to get a job.
We also spoke to Bishop Philip Huggins, Chair of the Social Responsibilities Committee of the Diocese of Melbourne, who stressed the importance of maintaining trust with the electorate.
And so it's absolutely essential that we be able to trust each other's words, that what people say is what they do. And at the heart of our faith is that honesty as a virtue. And it goes back to our understanding about God's word. God's word is trustworthy. We hear God's promises and we know they're real. And as people of faith, we base our lives on God's word and its trustworthiness. And right at the heart of our democracy, coming out of our Christian teaching and tradition is that our word must be trusted. And accordingly, when various parties come to elections and make their promises, it's crucial to the health of our democracy that people can believe those promises and that what they say they'll do, they'll do. But now this government, which made such a virtue of its trustworthiness and put so plainly on the public record that this is what it was promising and this is what it was going to do, to now in its first year and in its first budget, to so wantonly break the very promises that they've made to the Australian people, apart from the disappointment that there is with those people in themselves, it's so dangerous to our democracy. People's capacity to live in a civil society requires they be able to trust institutions, including our Parliament. And we know the issue of trust, particularly for the Church at the moment. We're rebuilding trust because some of our number have been not trustworthy. We know the issue painfully. The budget has lots of problems and issues with regards to the particular problems of affecting disadvantaged people and the risk that will create a permanent class of people who have limited or no access to education, employment and the dignity of a decent life. There's all those issues, but at a spiritual level, it's the issue of trust that is so consequential for the health and the vitality of our wonderful democratic Australia, in which everybody should be able to believe they can have a fair go and a decent opportunity.
Anglican Media Melbourne.